Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to kick off this inaugural event for the new American Engagement Initiative, an ambitious new project within our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. The new American Engagement Initiative will be a central component of the Scowcroft Center's cutting-edge work on grand strategy and the future of the global order. This new initiative is part of the integrated strategy plan in the Scowcroft Center in tandem with our Global Strategy Initiative that's also housed there. Context explains the importance of this new effort. We are at an inflection point of historic proportions on the order of 1918, 1945, or 1989. And this was likely true even before the COVID-19 pandemic, before the health and economic and psychological damage that the disease has caused. The civil unrest and anti-racist movement in response to the long-term systemic racism has been another shock to the system. And these crises remind Americans that we have much work to do right here at home. These circumstances, in many respects, so different from what the US national security community has been planning for, should make it clear that some of the old approaches to maintaining and advancing American and global security will not work alone. This cannot be business as usual. Unconventional and innovative thinking, informed by a deep understanding of dramatic global changes, is urgently required. The multiplicity of threats, many of which can't be addressed by force or by traditional diplomacy, demands a new form of American leadership, and one that works closely with US allies and partners, something fundamental to the Council's core. A form of engagement that reflects fiscal realities is also called for. The world is growing more complex, and US foreign policy professionals must find new ways to mobilize the full range of American tools of influence and craft a strategy that can tap into the true source of American power. That's the American people. All of us in the policymaking community must be willing to question conventional wisdom, to challenge traditional assumptions. And part of the reason why that has not yet happened is because the set of voices that are influencing real policy decisions is sometimes too limited. The new American Engagement Initiative will provide an intellectual home to these such scholars within the Scowcroft Center. Matt Burrows and new team member Chris Preble will lead this effort. They are intellectual forces of nature that you'll hear from shortly. Matt has long led our global trends work. Chris has been a consistent voice, including at Cato, of anchoring US foreign policy to the views of the American people. We're also building out and recruiting additional fellows, so raise your hand if you're interested and apply. But they will play a central role in generating these out-of-the-box US foreign policy ideas, and their work will be guided by a series of key questions, beginning with what long-standing assumptions have guided US foreign policy for decades? Which of these are most in need of closer scrutiny? Which should we keep? And which might be outdated? Can we learn from our mistakes to develop new modes of engagement? Is there a new model for American leadership? And beginning to answer all of these questions, we're grateful and honored to have today with us Ed Luce, the associate editor at the Financial Times, an eloquent voice on these issues, as our moderator for a discussion with our co-directors, Matt Burrows and Chris Preble, along with Susan Eisenhower, CEO and chairman of the Eisenhower Group. Susan and Ed, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd also like to invite everyone that's watching on our live stream and the broadcast to join today's conversation on Twitter and Instagram by following the Atlantic Council and AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag NAEI. But before we begin that conversation, I want to introduce my good colleague, Gina Wood, Vice President for Foundational Institutional Giving here at the Atlantic Council. Gina herself is a force of nature who's played a central role in bringing this initiative to fruition. Gina's also my partner in leading an effort across the Atlantic Council, looking holistically at the underpinnings of American foreign policy. And our goal is to connect a strategy of renewal at home to our leadership abroad, to better engage our citizens in our work, and to reflect our nation and all of its diversity in our work. The NAEI is going to be a key part of this. So with that, welcome to the program. Over to you, Gina.
Thanks, Damon. I first want to acknowledge our partners on this initiative, without whom we wouldn't be here today. We are so grateful for the generous support from the Charles Koch Institute and Pivotal Foundation, both new supporters for us, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who continues to be a longtime partner of the Atlantic Council. Thank you for your trust and for believing in our vision. We are especially thankful to our supporters for helping us develop this new venture, reconceptualizing U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. As our president and CEO, Fred Kemp, always says, and you've already heard from my colleague, Damon Wilson, we are at an inflection point in history, and navigating the changes ahead will require us to reevaluate and perhaps reframe our approach to some degree. In order to do so, we need to take an objective look at our current foreign policy and be willing to ask fresh, original, and even difficult questions. And this is precisely what the New American Engagement Initiative will do, with the end goal of identifying the best policies for U.S. engagement in the world. Developing new partnerships is extremely gratifying, particularly at a time of immense change in our country and the world. We're excited about the vote of confidence you have expressed in our leading this bold new initiative that we hope will challenge conventional thinking around U.S. foreign policy. My role has been to expand the Atlantic Council's philanthropic and institutional support, allowing our organization to grow and broaden our focus and certainly our impact. Developing and maintaining these relationships is critical to our success, and our partners' financial and intellectual support is what enables us to carry out our mission and diversify our viewpoints on the world. And I am proud that during my tenure, we have been able to establish so many new partnerships enriching our work. Over the past couple of years, for example, we have established 2 new world-class centers, the Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center and the Geotech Center. Both bring a diversity of partnerships with long-term commitments and new areas of expertise to the Council. The New American Engagement Initiative is our latest achievement in what I believe is a moment of great growth for the Atlantic Council. I am personally proud of the role I've been able to play in expanding and enriching the Atlantic Council and working with our leadership, along with our incredible center and program directors on such timely issues has been and continues to be a real pleasure. It's now my honor to introduce Edward Luce, who probably needs no introduction. We're all familiar with his column in Financial Times, where he is the U.S. National Editor and who will moderate today's event. So thank you all once again for being with us virtually. And now over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Gina, and congratulations on this launch. Thank you also, Damon. It's a great pleasure and honor to be invited to moderate your opening session of the New American Engagement Initiative. I can't think of a better time to be debating whether America needs to rethink not only its foreign policy, but first principles of how America engages with the world. I entirely share Matt's view that today is an inflection point comparable to 89, 45, 1917. This is a crossroads moment. We've been used to talking about, it's a bit of a cliche, the upcoming November election as being the most consequential in possibly our lifetimes, but certainly in recent memory, because of how it will affect America domestically. But of course, it's equally consequential in terms of America's posture to the world. 2 incredibly different visions. One, the American first, the Trumpian vision, and the other, at least until recently by Joe Biden, restoration vision of returning American policy implicitly to the status quo ante. And I think the New American Engagement Initiative, given who is leading it, Director Matt Burrows and co-director Chris Preble, but both of whom challenge conventional wisdom. I think the New American Engagement Initiative wants to think more profoundly than that. And as I say, I couldn't think of a better moment in time to launch an initiative like this. But let me start by asking Susan Eisenhower a question. And by the way, I should mention that Susan's got a forthcoming book, How Ike Led President Eisenhower's, the principles behind President Eisenhower's biggest decisions, of course, about Susan's grandfather. And just the very mention of the word Ike transports us to a very foreign policy in a very different America, in a very different world. And the word principles is quite a cold shower too, because we're out of habit of thinking along those lines. Susan, the New American Engagement Initiative talks about rethinking conventional wisdom, broadening the pool of people who contribute to American foreign policy, going back to first principles. What is America's purpose in the world, and how does it achieve it? How do you think about this question? How do you, in practice, go about challenging conventional wisdom and broadening the pool of DC-based foreign policy specialists who have always dominated this debate?
Well, thanks so much, Ed. First of all, it's great to see you again, and I'm honored to be here for this inaugural event. Just delighted to see Chris Preble and Matt Burrows, and I think they're going to do a wonderful job. And yes, going back to first principles is exactly the question that's before us. I think we are at an inflection point. And with that in mind, this is going to require strategy. I mean, a real strategy, not something that we call a strategy and then put people on television who say they're strategists. Frankly speaking, I don't think we've had a strategy for America's foreign policy for a very, very long time. And so we're going to have an opportunity now to relook at things. I think, Ed, you're also, the nature of your question is very interesting because we do have, I think, a crisis, not only politically in our country, because of the deep divisions many of our politicians continue to foster, and in some cases enlarge, but also the think tank community itself has enormous challenges it has to face. Like the political worlds, it too has become deeply divided. And there's a kind of hardening of views that has taken place, certainly ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I've experienced it myself, and I know colleagues on both sides of these important issues will acknowledge that this exists. So the fact that the Atlantic Council, and I'm so thrilled that the New American Initiative is part of the Scowcroft Center, because just to associate this project's name with Brent Scowcroft already says an enormous amount to me. And what we're going to have to do is to break down some of this siloed ways of looking at our policy and begin to look at ways to integrate a number of factors, many factors actually, as we chart a course forward, including the importance of our economic life, the challenges we're going to face both in budgeting and in debt management, the issues related to a generational war that's still underway overseas, and now what appears to be not only a healthcare crisis and a pandemic, but also rising social unrest. This is going to have to integrate both domestic and foreign policy to be able to come up with a proper foreign policy.
Okay, thank you, Susan. I want to get later on into what this strategy might look like in practice, a new strategy of America's engagement with the world, and also into specific foreign policy issues. You can't discuss America and foreign policy without looking at China and US-China relations. Right. And I want to get into that. And I want to get into American foreign policy in an age of pandemic. But let me just ask the same question I've just asked you to each of Matt and Chris. It's all very well talking about challenging conventional wisdom, but in practice, how do you do that? Matt, let me just start with you.
Well, I think it's a generational process. I think if you look at, number of articles, books now being written, trying to also making the point that we're on the wrong track, and that, we have some failures in our recent history that we have to come to grips with. I would say that would be the efforts to do regime change in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we have to think about, this different world as well, that it is a multipolar world. We can't think of ourselves as the one setting the rules for everybody, unless we think of trying to pull others, to us. And this is one of the problems, I think, with America First, is just a turnoff for the rest of the world. So I think that some of these lessons have already begun to percolate down. If you look at the number of articles talking about more restrained foreign policy, different ways of doing foreign policy, there is a sense, even among what I would say are people who tend to be on the spectrum of unipolarity, on primacy, that this time it is different. And, our means really are not, we don't have quite the same capabilities, either in a fiscal sense, or I would say in a political will sense. I mean, I think some people do share President Trump's views about getting out of the Middle East. So, as I think we actually have some wind at our back at this point. What it does mean, as Susan just said, of actually crafting a strategy that not only looks at ends and means, so fitting those together. I mean, we are a great power. We will remain the biggest power for some time. We do want, to our values to survive in this multipolar world. At the same time, we have to recognize, as I said before, with the limitations. I think getting those arguments out, I think crafting a strategy that pulls together all these ideas, I actually think people are ready to gravitate to something like that. But nevertheless, it is constantly beating the drums, getting more people involved, and getting the message out.
You that wasn't a call from another think tank complaining. Chris, can we get a little bit down into sort of brass tacks here in terms of who would be these new people that American? Who would be these new circles that would be brought in? Who are the players that are now not being listened to, that whose absence is contributing to the staleness, if you like, of the foreign policy debate in Washington?
Right. Thanks, Ed. Thanks for your question, and thanks, of course, for moderating this. I think there are two types of groups of people that we're talking about here. First of all, it is generational. I want to really echo what Matt said, is the generation of millennials, that is to say younger than me, who have grown up in an environment where the United States is confronted almost every day by unique challenges, and challenges that in an earlier generation, I think many Americans would have just assumed that we can take care of this and everyone else will sort of follow along. I think that the younger scholars are much more open to questioning those assumptions without throwing out all of the assumptions that have guided U.S. foreign policy, either for the last 70 years or for the last 240, frankly. And so sort of separating the assumptions that are worthy of resurrecting and renovating and those that really need to be cast aside starts with inviting and welcoming a new generation of younger scholars, and that's something that we're going to be very active in. The other group of people who I think are not well represented, and certainly not well represented enough within the Washington, D.C. foreign policy community, and to a lesser extent within the broader media, are a group of scholars who have been writing about grand strategy for many years, but whose ideas have not necessarily been embraced by the foreign policy community. I think partly, again, that's a function of a resistance on the part of some in the foreign policy establishment to the idea that things aren't working perfectly fine. If you think things are working perfectly fine, then you don't really go looking for new voices, whether they're younger people or people from outside of the Beltway, so to speak. So I think that one of the things that the New American Engagement Initiative is going to do, and we're committed to doing, is to integrating younger scholars and scholars who are not as well represented here in DC, or there in DC when we're all not virtually in our various places. One last point I want to emphasize, and it sort of, this bears repeating. We do have a crisis of not connecting our goals, what we are trying to achieve, and the ways and means that we will achieve them. And I think that scrutinizing both of those things is going to be critical for the New American Engagement Initiative. It's not merely a question of what instruments have not worked as well or will not work as well. So we will talk a lot, of course, about the military, the shortcomings in the military, but I want to mention, I served in the United States military. I have a very keen sense of what that service can do and what the men and women in uniform can do, but I also recognize its limitations. But we cannot simply focus on the means that need to be revisited. We also need to scrutinize our goals. What are we trying to accomplish, and how do we put those in rank order? What are the most important things? What are the second and third order things? That's something we also need to do.
I'm glad you mentioned the military, because I want to get into America's military role. But let me just, sticking with you briefly, Chris, you mentioned that the kind of fellows you'd like to take on would be, those who might ordinarily not get the opportunity to be part of the foreign policy debate. If you think back to the sort of great post-war era of American foreign policy, of Cold War, probably the three biggest names you could come up with are George Kennan, Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I know was a regular
Right.
at the Atlantic Council. And at least two of those, Spig and Kennan, were extremely bad at PR. They were not afraid of offending people, making enemies, not deliberately, but via telling what they thought was the truth. In other words, they didn't emerge through the Washington game, which is very, very different to that. It's about not offending people. It's about playing safe.
Right.
That's how you get ahead. So what you're really talking about here is a culture change, to go back to the kind of era where awkward, non-team playing kind of brains can break through. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, I think that is correct. I think that one of the great advantages of the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center is that integrating the New American Engagement Initiative within that framework is inviting these new voices to be a part of this broader strategy work. And you mentioned Kennan, Brzezinski, and Kissinger. Might I also mention Brent Scowcroft?
Of course.
I've had a chance to read a bit more about him over the course of the last few months. And there were some critical inflection points during his career that he was central to, and recognizing, particularly coming out of the Vietnam era, for example, that hubris and overreach was a problem that the United States needed to account for. And of course, his principled stand in opposition of the Iraq War in 2002 at much personal risk to him. And so I think that recognizing that there have been sort of discordant voices in America's history, and especially in the recent history, and yet these people are, in retrospect, respected in spite of sometimes being seen as out of step. So I would love if, 5 or 10 or 15 years hence, we look back on voices that maybe were not getting the same attention they are right now. If we are getting more attention to those voices 5 or 10 years hence, then I think the New American Engagement Initiative and the Atlantic Council have to at least take some of the credit for that.
Matt, any thoughts to add to that? How do you make DC safe for the Brzezinskis and Kennans and Scowcrofts of this world? Your mic, you need to turn.
Your mic.
I'm not sure in this era of social media that you can be, safe if you have unconventional views. And we have to, nevertheless encourage really plain speaking. And I think it comes down to that and a willingness. And of course, this position is, we have, as Gina has said, foundation backing. So in a sense, we have that luxury of being able to talk truth to power with some, security behind it. And that's why we wanted a unit that in some sense has that ability, should have that ability, and obviously should be thinking, I would say, about the longer term vision for the U.S. And I think that is also something that is really lacking.
So Chris mentioned the role of the military. Susan, thinking back to your grandfather's 2 terms as president, and the fact that he ended the Korea War, and didn't embark on any new big ones. Of course, Vietnam happened under his successors, Kennedy and LBJ.
Right.
And yet America was really predominant. That was perhaps the best example, Ike's era of carrying a big stick, but often speaking softly. How radically do you think today we should be reimagining the role in which the Pentagon and the military plays in America's foreign policy face to the world? Because my guess is, if you did a poll of people around the world of how America engages with the world, people would probably overstate the degree to which America is about wars of choice and interventions and regime change and drone attacks, and they would probably exaggerate it. It's so central to America's image, superpower, and not necessarily very helpful to America's image. How would you reimagine the role of the military?
Well, that's it's an excellent question, and just going back to Dwight Eisenhower, he came into the presidency in January of 1953 and ended the Korean War by July of 1953. From 1953 until the end of his administration, there was not one combat death during that time, which in the context of today's environment is just a stunning record. I think the other thing that I found very interesting in doing all of my research, and I know Chris Preble's written a great book about this too, is that a 5-star general who was the Supreme Allied Commander in the European theater that beat the Nazis actually had a tremendously difficult time with his military. This happened on a number of occasions. After Sputnik, there was the 1957 Defense Reform Act. He is literally taking on the very army that he used to be part of. And then with the missile gap and other occasions like that, I mean, it was really very, very tough. The president had a hard time fighting back, not only the military, but frankly, all their lobbyists. There was a stunning number of people in that field. Now, if Ike was having a hard time and he was a 5-star general, by the way, said to General Andrew Goodpaster once, "God help this nation, when somebody sitting in this chair doesn't know as much about the military as I do," you can imagine what confronts any real and radical change, as we might discuss here in the future through this project and through other efforts underway elsewhere. It's going to be very, very tough. And I'd like to associate myself with Chris and Matt when they say that we have to figure out what we're trying to accomplish. I swear to God, you wouldn't be able to find anybody in Washington or frankly anywhere else who knows what we're now trying to accomplish in the Middle East, what we're trying to accomplish with China or Russia or anything else. Are we wishing to create an international sphere of cooperation, or is this going to be basically a confrontational relationship? It doesn't mean that you have to get there right away, but you certainly have to know where you're headed. And I think this is already, for this project and for people who care about grand strategy and strategy, this is going to be a really important undertaking. First off, is to figure that out, because there is not generalized agreement on that subject.
Can I jump in on that too, Ed?
Sure.
I think that we all are aware that the military as an institution and the men and women who wear the uniform are held in exceptionally high regard by the American people. It is one of the very few institutions that can still claim that. That is both an opportunity and a risk. The risk is that we put too much faith in the opinions of people who have military expertise but don't know a lot about lots of other things, and yet we rely on them to tell us about everything from reverse mortgages to how we're going to handle healthcare. On the other hand, we have now a generation of senior enlisted and junior officers and now mid-grade officers who have been fighting the wars of the post 9/11 era. And many of them have a very keen appreciation for the limits of military power. And more and more of them are willing to speak out. Some of them are members of Congress. So I think that that is an opportunity that we should take advantage of. One last point. I've been writing about this for a number of years. When the United States of America chooses to deploy forces abroad, when we are choosing to risk the lives of American servicemen and women in action, we need to have some very clear criteria when we do. And those include a clear definition of what the national interest is at stake, the mission that they are being asked to perform, the likely cost and duration of that mission, and critically, we must know that that mission has the full support of the American people. And I think if we stuck to those principles, these are not revolutionary principles. There are elements of this from the Weinberger-Powell Doctrine, and as recently as just in the last issue of Foreign Affairs, former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates basically articulated a similar set of principles. If we stuck to a set of principles like that, I think we would be less likely to lead with the military, where we intervene first and then figure out what we're going to do once the forces are in action. And I think that would be a critical step to get us back on track.
Ed, if I could just add one thing here very quickly. I think that Chris is completely correct, but we have to recognize that we dismantled most of the institutions that helped establish and expand our soft power overseas. And soft power is a subject that we rarely discuss anymore. So I do hope this initiative is going to be front and center and bringing that idea back into American debate.
Picking up on what you and Chris have just said, particularly that quote from your grandfather about God help somebody who knows less than me about the military. The fact that he did understand the military gave him the power, the sort of Nixon goes to China power, to take them on and ignore their advice and take his own decisions, which suggests that quite the opposite of what our fears might be, that a Praetorian Guard is going to take over the Republic, but that we should be, Matt, listening more to the military, those who've actually fought and who understand the limitations of war, and indeed the benefits too. Is there something to that, Matt?
In my experience, the military is the first to say they don't want to be engaged in all the different missions. And, recently, Bob Gates wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where he made the same points that Susan just said about, the State Department being really decimated, USIA, the United States Information Agency, all of these other instruments of US power actually being downgraded. And I think, this is, I would say, a problem with on the congressional side, where the military always gets a lot of support, but even when this happened during the second term of Obama, when Bob Gates and Hillary Clinton went up to argue for more funding for the State Department, nothing really happened after that. So, there does need to be a leader who understands the different instruments of power, realizes that the military can't be the one that does everything, and understand that the military actually doesn't want to get involved in nation building and all of these tasks that have been thrust on it, but also begin to bring the State Department into the 21st century, and also the other agencies. And then I would make a plug. I mean, we get there's a huge amount of US power that we have because we educate the world's elite. And, during this presidency, we are basically telling international students, just go home, stay home. And if you particularly want to study anything in science and technology, we don't want you here. I think, the person-to-person contact is one of the best ways, actually, of increasing U.S. power, certainly of understanding of our system, which is very difficult to really know about if you're not, I would say, even a Washington insider. So we have a lot of sources of power that we are underutilizing. And that's part of the aim of this unit, is to talk about how you can actually increase US power without always playing the military card.
Now, in about sort of 12, 15 minutes, I'll take the questions that are coming up on the Q&A here. But let me just ask about the pandemic. A lot of people have remarked, I think correctly, that America's brand damage has been quite huge, not just for its inability to flatten the curve at home, but America's absence, really uniquely since the Second World War, from helping others to cope with a global disaster, global emergency. America has really been absent. So that's the negative side of it. Positive side is, could this prompt the kind of rethinking of how valuable American soft power tools are, whether they be its membership of the WHO, USAID, the visas you were just talking about, the human-to-human interaction, the scholarships, all the stuff that's been downgraded in the last few years. Could the pandemic have a silver lining in making Americans realize how valuable these things are? And I mean, any of you can pick this up, but Chris, why don't I throw that at you?
Sure, thanks, Ed. I think it could have that effect. I think we should be driving towards it having that effect. I know my colleagues in the Scowcroft Center are trying to do that even as we speak. But I'll also call attention to the fact that your column in the FT today, for those watching if haven't read it, the reaction and the response by the United States and the UK to COVID has really damaged the brand. So it's a lesson that in order to lead, you need to lead by example. You need to demonstrate that you are capable of solving problems at home before people are going to trust you to solve their problems many thousands of miles from your shore. The other point is about soft power. The other instruments of American power, or frankly any great nation's power, are so much more than its military, the use of force and coercion. However, some of those instruments are not easily wielded by a government. Governments can interfere with trade, as ours has. Governments can interfere with cultural exchange, as ours has. That is, the example that Matt just cited about foreign students studying here in the United States. But with the exception of diplomacy, we do not entrust many soft power tools to the federal government. So one of my areas of focus will be on thinking more holistically about non-military instruments of American power and how to mobilize those instruments in ways that do not rely on the US government or other governments to put them in place. Oftentimes it's a case of staying out of the way, not letting government interfere with those kinds of constructive engagement that actually have a pretty good track record.
In terms of my column, Chris, we're going to become firm friends. Anybody who mentions my column is a mensch. It sounds like, from a lot of what all of you are saying, in terms of less of a stress on military, bulking up Americans' diplomacy, using non-state agencies and holistic means to rethink. It sounds not a million miles away, and I imagine you would all agree that America should repair its alliances, whether that be in Europe or in Asia or elsewhere. That doesn't sound a million miles away from the direction Biden seems to be heading. Now, Biden hasn't yet published a formal China policy paper. His campaign hasn't yet articulated a formal China policy. But on the sort of general stuff, what you're all saying, and I personally happen to agree with almost everything you're saying, but what you're all saying sounds like a return to the status quo ante minus wars of choice. Am I wrong there?
Ed, I'd like to just get to your question and put it in a broader sense. The purpose of national security is to assure the safety of the American people. And I'd like to make a little prediction here. I think we could say over the course of many decades, authority figures have lost slowly their reputations as institutional groups. You can see that in religious circles. You can see it in the polling figures about how people feel about our members of the government, the federal government, the Congress, et cetera, et cetera. I think we're going to have a public that's really ready to talk about what the definition of national security is. And what this pandemic has done has really threatened, I think, all of the thinking that the elite has promoted here for some length of time. Maybe there are many people in Washington who'd like to regard China as the next big threat, but I think the American people are beginning to say, wait a minute, the threat that actually killed my family members, that made me ill, so ill, in fact, that I'm going to have a permanent disability, that wasn't any country. That was something we weren't prepared for, that had to do with a healthcare system that doesn't work, systemic inequalities, all kinds of other things. And so when we get to how to think about China and some of these other foreign countries, I think you're going to find the public has less and less of an appetite for taking on great power rivalries again, especially if they have the potential to spin out of control. And then let me just end this thought by saying that I completely agree with my colleagues who say the military are usually the first to have thought this through. If you want to have an absolutely spectacular debate on the depth and the diversity of challenges to this country, you go to a place like West Point. I've lectured up there, and I go up quite frequently, and they're always talking about things you would never dream of talking about in Washington. And so I think that we're going to find that there's a big shift. The elite is in trouble in the eyes of most Americans, and I even hate the word elite because I don't think it's accurate, but certainly those who have been in the public spaces. And so let me leave it there, except to say that our strategists better think very carefully about other ways to manage a situation like China and Russia. In addition to the last resort, which should be some kind of military confrontation. But we're going to have to find some other ways so we can tend to our knitting here.
Sorry, carry on, Chris.
Ed, let me go back to your original question. I think if it were as simple as no more wars of choice, well, then who's not on board with that? The problem becomes that defining which is a war of choice and which is a war of necessity becomes the nature of the state. And so long as the United States has the military capability to project great power over great distances with seemingly little effort, we can get involved in wars, we just can't win the wars that we get into. Again, that's why I think it's so critical to have criteria for deciding before we get involved militarily and trying to exhaust the other instruments of American power before we resort. The use of force should be a last resort. And the other point is that the nature of the threats that are particularly conducive to military instruments are the kinds that are not that we're not dealing with right now. The military not only is not well adapted to deal with COVID-19. We saw tragically in the case of some of the Navy ships that have been ravaged by this disease, that is particularly vulnerable to this disease. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for Americans to wonder whether some even tiny increment that has been spent on the military might have been more productively spent on dealing with infectious diseases or other public health instruments that would have been equally effective against whether it's respiratory disease or a vascular disease or something like that. So I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that more and more people will start asking those questions, and we frankly will take advantage of this moment to push people in that direction.
Matt, Susan mentioned and Chris alluded to China and the American people's lack of appetite for confrontation, and I think ordinarily we might all sort of agree with the American people's instinct, but Xi Jinping is making that harder and harder and harder. The recent aggression in Ladakh on the China-India border, the closing down of many of Hong Kong's freedoms, general sort of Chinese robustness, often military, in its region, and the rhetoric. Just today, Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, said US-China relations are the worst they've been since they were normalized in 1979, Spik-Brzezinski's deal. How do we reimagine American foreign policy when there is a rising hegemon that is increasingly aggressive?
I think the first thing that we should recognize is, and this goes back a little bit to what Susan was saying, is that it's not in our interest to fall into a Cold War with China. I mean, there is a certain opinion in Washington, I would say, not on the business side, but on the national security side, that would kind of like to cut off everything connected with China. And then it's very easy. Then you can, go back to a playbook that we had with the Soviet Union. Then we have to think about, we are going to have differences. This is a country that believes that it's restoring where it should already be. It's very nationalistic, including the younger generation. So there's all the potential for real conflict. We have to think about ways that, one thing, increase the communication and the channels of communication. And that's another reason why you shouldn't cut off these are the elite sons and daughters who are coming to the US to study. So you want to keep all the different channels of communication open. And we have to think about ways there of communicating what some of our red lines are, not in a public sense, but much more through private diplomacy. And real telling them, I think one of the problems now is that they think that the US is in real decline. So they are ignoring maybe themselves the potential for getting into conflict with the US, because they don't think the US will really react. And I think that's a huge mistake. So we have to ensure that they understand where we will have to intervene or not, but also find ways. I mean, if you think back to the actual Cold War, ways that we helped to dissipate some of the frictions and tensions is to open up all sorts of people-to-people channels, the economic side, try to get them back to seeing that, opening their markets is in their interests, getting away from the rhetoric that's been in this White House about trying to keep China down, which, for their own public purposes, the Xi Jinpings and others can't ever allow China to be seen as going back to the 19th century with a great power like the US, setting the rules for it. So I think, this really requires the diplomacy side. It requires really getting experts on China and being willing to engage. They have a point of view. Even you'd say the liberals in this really believe that China has been held down. We have to understand them, and we have to find ways of living with them, not trying to convert them necessarily to our ways of thinking, but ways of living together. And where we have mutual interests, and we have quite a few of those, of really pushing those.
In about 5 minutes, there are lots of good questions coming through. I'm going to start asking. So if other viewers want to put questions, I'll pose them to the panel in about 5 minutes. But let me just stick to China. Susan and Chris, Biden's changed his rhetoric on China. He's become more hawkish. The pandemic, I think, and the fact that he's the nominee have pushed him in a more hawkish direction. Not nearly as hawkish as some people, certainly not as hawkish as President Trump, but more hawkish than he was 6 months ago, even. And talk of, across the spectrum, of decoupling, as if it's, like sort of closing an account at Bloomingdale's or something. Talk of decoupling, sort of easy thing we should do, has become conventional wisdom. Do you think it should be conventional wisdom, or do you think it will remain conventional wisdom?
I'll take that, Ed. Absolutely not. I think that talk of decoupling the United States from China is dangerous and short-sighted and reckless. That is not to say that there aren't serious issues that we need to reconcile between us and China. But here's where I think we can listen to our allies. We hear this a lot. Our allies they do not want to be asked to choose between the United States or China. Don't put them in that position. And part of the reason why is because to decouple, to go in the direction that those who are arguing for decoupling, is to ask people to choose one way or the other. I'm a historian of the Cold War. Susan mentioned this, the work that I did in the late 1950s, early 1960s. We have to remember that during the Cold War, there was virtually no trade between the United States and the Soviet Union. If for no other reason, what we are in today is not at all like that, and we shouldn't want it to be like that. The integration between the United States and China and all the other countries around the world is a source of strength and a source of leverage that the United States and our allies and partners should be using much more effectively. So I would come out fairly forcefully against the argument for decoupling. I think that is not the right approach. And here again is where we really have to listen to what other voices around the world are telling us, because they also really do not want to go in that direction.
Susan.
Ed, I would add to that. I think Chris makes an excellent point. Our allies should be able to. They are our allies after all, and we need to hear them out much more. But this is all part of Joe Biden becoming more hawkish and the rest of it. I have to say that who's surprised? Both the Republicans and the Democrats today use national security as really a domestic issue. And I think this is one of the big changes that's occurred over time. There used to be something called the Washington Consensus. We understood what we were doing thanks to, a Solarium project, which was an effort to bring all sides of different issues together to find a policy that would last. The interconnection between domestic politics and foreign policy, I think, is extremely dangerous. And it all seems to revolve around a bigger psychological issue in this country. And maybe this initiative can, if you're looking for other voices, why not bring on a psychologist and people who really study the psychology of nations and the rest of it. But everything is around worrying about whether or not either a politician or the country looks weak. Now, I understood why that was important during the Cold War, but strength can be derived from all kinds of other factors. Dwight Eisenhower believed deeply in that idea that strength is made up of a lot of things, including, your economy and your moral authority and your military capability being just one of those pillars. So as long as we're all worrying about whether we look weak or strong, we're not going to be relying on the other tools to play a part in putting together a coherent and well-integrated strategy. So I think that's one place we could start. We could stop, tweeting about other people's weakness, because it only drives them to do things that are not in our generalized interest.
I've just been, thank you, Susan. I've just been at the same time glancing at some of the questions that have come up, and there's an interesting commonality to some of them. So let me just combine one. Gail Kitcher asked, what's the role of the public in shaping foreign policy? How does our approach involving the public in determining our values, priorities, trade-offs, etc.? And from Elizabeth, a very good question. In terms of widening the universe of voices in this course, what are your thoughts about truly new voices, including women, people of color, new immigrant Americans, labor, civil society, technologists, etc. And I think in terms of American foreign policy, if you're thinking of people of color, there are two women whose last name is Rice, and it's pretty hard beyond, and Colin Powell, of course, to think beyond that. It is not a diverse business, American diplomacy. Can I? Who would like to answer that?
I'll take that, Ed. I think, somewhat by coincidence, this is also a major initiative within the Atlantic Council to connect to the instruments of American power, and that means connecting to the American people. And so I commend the organization for this. Again, it just sort of happened serendipitously that I arrived and the New American Initiative engagement launched when this other initiative moves forward. And I think it is absolutely critical to engage the American people, to listen to the American people, to communicate clearly to them. And people would argue, well, we've always done that. Well, not always well. We have to remember that another way to engage the American people, this gets to a little bit of what Susan said, is to scare the hell out of them. And I think there's a real fine line between listening to the American people, listening to what they want American foreign policy to accomplish, and invoking the scary distant boogeyman, which can easily become, the suspected, your neighbor because they talk differently or came from somewhere else. We should be very sensitive to that. So I think there are good and bad ways to engage the public, but most importantly, we have to engage the public. And I go back to my criteria for the use of force. Has always been the case. If the public is not supportive of a foreign policy objective, whether it's the use of force, whether it's diplomacy, it will not survive over the long term. And so I think it's just really wrong-headed and to assume that U.S. foreign policy can proceed without the strong support of the American people.
Let me put this question from Ellen Frost, who says there's one country towards which American policy has been stuck for 40 years without success, overwhelmingly focused on the nuclear issue and to a much lesser extent in the Middle East. But Iran is a regional power with an educated population, rich culture and history. So she poses the following questions. What are Iran's legitimate interests in the Middle East? What are our legitimate interests? And is there any overlap?
I'll take that. Matt was looking like he was ready to answer, but I'll jump in there and maybe he'll come in and clean up after me. The fact that this question was asked in the first place, but I don't think it's asked often enough, just in general. What are Iran's interests in the Middle East, and can we in any way reconcile with what their legitimate interests are? That has been a subject that has not been widely discussed in Washington. I think there was a moment during the second Obama administration with the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I was a strong supporter of that deal. And unfortunately, again, this where when public sentiment is not brought along in the process, then it can be undone too quickly. So I would be the first to say that we need to revisit some of our key assumptions in the Middle East. And one of those is the assumption that the United States and Iran are locked in an irreconcilable mode of conflict. And I think that we should start there and question whether or not there cannot be some accommodation or a reaching of an agreement between the two countries on what legitimate interests are in the region and beyond.
Let me.
I just to jump in, I would say, one thing the U.S. could do is just allow its allies to trade with Iran. In some ways, the U.S. gets back to this nationalistic question. If we're in the frame, I think then Iran itself is less able to compromise. And I think if you allow your allies, which we haven't under this administration, to trade, to develop those linkages, I think, that is one way to, I think we all share the eventual hope of getting rid of the regime, but in a very peaceful way, or one which the domestic side takes care of.
So I have a comment and a question from Dan Freed, who of course needs no introduction. I'm not sure whether the comment's aimed at me or somebody else, but Dan, I think perfectly reasonably enough, says it's silly to complain that conformity is the way to get ahead in the Washington foreign policy community. It wasn't for me. That's fair enough, Dan. Now, Dan's question. Of course, the US has made blunders, Vietnam, Iraq, but suggestions I hear so far are too easy. Don't overextend, question assumptions, encourage plain speaking, sure. But so what? What assumptions need to be questioned? What is the strategic alternative to the US-led international system that favors freedom? Is it isolationism, spheres of influence? Which is it? Matt, perhaps I can pose that to you.
My old nemesis. First, it is not isolationism. I mean, this is not what this initiative is about. It is understanding, and I think it goes back to what Chris and Susan and I were all saying about understanding our means and ends. I mean, we have to recognize that we did commit very costly blunders. And if we want to move ahead, we have to be understanding of what our means are. We also have to be thinking, I would say, much more as first among equals instead of the first, trying to unilaterally decide what is in everybody's interests. And the rules that we set down are for others, not necessarily for us. So in a sense, it is thinking about our place as the one who can put together coalitions. I mean, we've done very well when we have put together coalitions in the past. So in that sense, it's not new, but it is something that we obviously did not do with the Iraq War. We have to think about, and goes back to the point on China, if we want to really influence them, is to make them see that we actually have allies in that region, but also in the rest of the world, and working with them. It means we don't necessarily get our way on everything, and we have to be prepared and to think that that is not a weakness if we don't get that. I mean, this is just an accommodation to basically a rapidly changing world, one in which I would say is much more multipolar, and we have to recognize that these are up and coming powers, and we would want to try to get them on our side.
And can I jump in right behind on that? The emergence of a multipolar order that is populated mostly by American allies and partners who are committed to principles of the rules-based order that once upon a time Uncle Sam had to impose on them by force or drag them kicking and screaming into. This rules-based order now is sustained by the common interests of many of these countries who buy into these rules. In fact, the great concern that I have is that the United States is too often seen as going outside of these rules. The message, for thee, but not for me. So it starts with modeling the behavior that we expect of others, listening much more to our allies and partners, recognizing that they do have common interests, that they do have intentions that align with our own, and not expecting that were it not for the United States sustaining the rules-based order, it would collapse. The good news, and I think we have to recognize this as a good news story, the good news is that order is now very widely embraced by many allies and partners. And that was not the case at the founding of the post-World War II era. If for no other reason, many of the countries that we now count as allies and partners were colonial empires holding in some form of lesser status, literally hundreds of millions of people. That system is gone, and I think we should be glad for it.
Can I add, Ed, I'd like to add one other idea here. The notion that we're going to be able to be the world's sole leader, or to play the kind of leadership role we played before this pandemic, I think is really called into question. And I say this with a very heavy heart. We have revealed to the world that we were unprepared for something we had warning on, and that even in the face of this pandemic, we have been unable to unite ourselves towards this this disease, which is I mean, it's been a shocking display of America's vulnerabilities. And we are not going to get US leadership back in the way we've ever had it unless we begin to get our own act together. It's as simple as that. When I talk to my colleagues in Europe about the United States, I have a friend in Australia who's always saying, what on earth is going on in your country? And now we know we can't even rely on you in any way, shape, or form, because you can't organize yourself. You've just revealed to the whole world that you can't even prepare if you have this warning, as I mentioned earlier. So I guess that's my answer to the question, you know, the legitimate question that was asked. But I think a tremendous amount of damage has been done. And, you know, before we can even get to the bigger part of strategy, we've got to figure out how to get through this crisis too. And maybe that's not the goal of this initiative, but all Americans have to be asking themselves, you know, how are we going to get through this crisis with our dignity and with our security intact?
Let me thank you, Susan. Let me, any of you can pick this up. Harlan Ullman, who I think you all know, asks, says, the issue is implementation. It's easy to critique any administration, especially the Trump administration, but whether Trump or Biden comes next, and if the latter, it will take a long time to settle in. How does a new strategy get implemented? And I think he means by that there's going to be, you know, kind of 1860 sort of political climate here, making it very, very hard to establish the sort of consensus you need to pursue lasting foreign policy.
Well, I think you, in some respects, Ed, you answered the question, which is, and thanks to Harlan for the question, is I think we need to be fairly modest in our initial objectives, both as an organization, as an initiative, but also as a country. We need to incrementally make improvements. We need to work much more closely with allies and partners. We need to rely, to some extent, more heavily on them. But let's try to secure some early wins. Let's try to avoid some early own goals. If that sounds like a fairly modest set of objectives, Harlan, then guilty as charged. But I think we can see the alternative of that approach, where the administration coming in made a number of errors that really set us back, and even if they were inclined to, we're not in a position to recover from it. So I think it is important for the Biden team, or for the Trump second administration and second term, if it comes to that, to identify now what they would like to achieve early and what it's going to take to get there. And I'd like to believe that this initiative and others within the Atlantic Council and beyond could help that process along. But, you know, the notion of humility is one that is of great value to human beings and even to superpowers. And so I would urge us all to sort of keep that idea in mind.
Unfortunately, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and sort of do fingers on buzzers and lightning rounds. John Gay asks, doesn't the combatant command system create public choice incentives for parts of the military to advocate an expansive military role, at least in their region of focus? Aren't we basically being wagged by the tail of the military?
Well, since I mentioned the military-industrial complex, maybe I need to answer that and just say it all gets back to our civilian leadership. We are not a country that would ever permit, you know, a military person to be running the country. Sure, Dwight Eisenhower was a 5-star general, but he had to resign his commission to run for the presidency. We have civilian leadership in our country, and I don't think you can blame the military for a lack of resolve on the part of the civilian leadership to devise a strategy, figure out which tools are appropriate under what circumstances, and to have a strong, ready military. If the military is driving the agenda, then we just don't have the right leadership at the top of our civilian establishment.
Thank you, Susan. One from Faisal Dorji. Robert Kagan said, Americans in foreign policy are torn to the point of schizophrenia. They are reluctant, then aggressive, asleep at the switch, then quick at the trigger, indifferent, then obsessed, then indifferent again. The view from the African continent is that US foreign policy has moved away from constructive engagement of Jimmy Carter to plain old military engagement, even during the time of Obama. Is there sufficient wisdom in Washington to move foreign policy that is underpinned by humanitarian values?
That wasn't where I thought the question was going, because I think part of the reason why the United States became more militarily involved in Africa, especially and increasingly in sub-Saharan Africa, was because of the counterterrorism and the obsession with the fighting post 9/11. So I think there are ways to the United States to interact with Africa. It starts with not elevating counterterrorism and combating violent extremism as the top of the list, and putting much more emphasis on trade and economic exchange, which again others have figured out. I think interesting the way the question played out, because I thought it was going to be much more focused on how the United States has militarized U.S. involvement in Africa. And I think that in many respects that speaks to what the New American Engagement Initiative is trying to do, which is to elevate the other instruments of American power and privilege trade and diplomacy over the use of force.
I would just add that I think, the U.S.'s role, humanitarian role, is it may not be government run anymore. I mean, but you have obviously the Gates Foundation, which has put great amount of emphasis on countering diseases in sub-Saharan Africa. You have other bodies that led the charge on HIV. So I would say that, when you're thinking of U.S., you should think actually more broadly, maybe as Chris was saying, I mean, under the war on terror, there was a lot more focus on the military side. But we should be, when we think about U.S. power, we should thinking about how to unleash this private sector efforts. That's a plus for us.
Very, very quickly. And I'll stick with you, Matt, since you are the director for this final question. Kissinger, and I'm also picking you out because I suspect there is a realist lurking within you. Kissinger advocated a linkage strategy between various aspects of Soviet behavior to reward and punish. Would such an approach work with China?
It's an interesting question. I think there are, China they tend to be realists. They tend to have this engineering, scientific background where they see things in very concrete terms. I think, obviously they're also great admirers of Henry Kissinger. And in many ways, the ones who actually, got the U.S., presented this case that they would go and renew ties with the U.S. if because of their worries over the Soviet Union and the aggression of the Soviet Union. So they themselves are realists. So yes, I think you could present some of those exchanges. I think the one thing is you have to realize what are some of their red lines. And if you don't recognize them as this great rising power with the ability to have influence in their region and beyond, then I think it will be very hard to get them into a real discussion on quid pro quos.
So let me apologize to those whose questions I didn't have time to get round to. But most of all, to thank Susan, Chris, and Matt for really, really covering a lot of ground very, very well and very, very interestingly. I enjoyed that and learned from that, and was very pleased to be associated with your inaugural event. Thank you, and thank you to everybody for watching. I will now turn over to Damon, who I can see on the screen.
And terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you for that marvelous job, and really appreciate you, Ed, joining for this inaugural event to kick off the New American Engagement Initiative. We love reading you in the Financial Times. What a great discussion. I welcome the debate, particularly as the questions came in. After all, that is the point of this initiative, to stimulate and spark this kind of debate. I want to give a special thanks to Susan Eisenhower for joining us. It was just fabulous to have you back with us, Susan. And we're so looking forward to your book when it comes back. We'll welcome you back on the screen for that, I hope. And thanks to Matt and Chris, who are our intellectual entrepreneurs who are really committed to building out this new effort. Everybody who follows the Atlantic Council's work understands that our mission is about helping to ensure the United States, working with its partners, its friends, its allies, is shaping a better future. And within our Scowcroft Center, this initiative, the New American Engagement Initiative, is a critical component of that agenda and how we're going to establish it as a go-to place for innovative thinking. So I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I encourage you to come back for the next Atlantic Council programs. We can see you back today at 4 o'clock on a debrief of U.S.-Mexico and the Mexican president's visit. Tomorrow morning at 9 for a discussion on is Africa ready for a new Marshall Plan, or tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 on how artificial intelligence can secure our energy critical infrastructure. And with that, thank you so much for joining the Atlantic Council. We'll see you back here.